Hi, everybody. Welcome to the SDG Global Action Festival of Action. And some of you guys are joining us from inside the Zoom webinar, and some participants are joining from the festival's virtual event platform. So welcome to everybody. Before we kick off, we have a bit of housekeeping that was provided to us by the UN SDG Action Campaign team, which I'll go through really quickly before diving into our webinar. First, please note that this session is part of the SDG Global Festival of Action. So if you're joining here directly on Zoom, we strongly encourage you to log into the event platform afterwards, and the link will be shared in the chat. So if you don't have it already, you'll get there. There's a lot of awesome stuff happening, 6 stages, meetings, connecting with other people, and 20 exhibits, and a whole bunch of other amazing stuff in a resource library. Second of all, by joining this webinar, everybody on the panel consents to their image and audio being broadcast. So for those of you joining on Zoom, we hope you have the opportunity to be featured, and if we don't, then if we do feature you, then you have given your consent. We also have strict broadcast regulations. So for anybody here who is promoted to have their mic and camera turned on, no logos, flags, or music are permitted in the background. And unfortunately, if those regulations are broken, then the organizers will have to remove participants. So with that, we have a Q&A box, and we will try to integrate as much of your thoughts as possible. We have a few polls throughout, but I will preface this by saying this is a super dense workshop, which I'm really excited to go through. It's based on a much larger training, but we're going to give you some of the key highlights today. And so welcome, and I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me as I do that. So here we go. If you guys can see my screen, can you give me a thumbs up to let me know you guys see it? Can you guys do thumbs up or put a hi in the Q&A box or something to the effect? Okay, I think I see people. Okay, hi everybody. So this is the Outrage to Action Adaptive Leadership Masterclass. And my name is Hizami Baramata, and I am the founder and CEO of the Humanity Lab Foundation. And our mission is to unlock human potential and democratize access to power and change. So welcome. Quick snapshot about my past, which makes me so passionate about teaching this workshop and all the work that we do, is I come from a background of government consulting and really helping organizations, brands, and people figure out how to make awesome impact in the world. And through that, have had amazing opportunities to work at the United Nations, including most recently serving as the coordinator for the UN Secretary General's World Humanitarian Summit. Now, the reason I bring this up is a lot of the leadership training that we've developed actually is anchored in a lot of the conversations around how do we make the SDGs actionable, but then also a lot of the experiences that I've had working with governments, private sector, public sector, on the frustrations of why is change not happening? How can we be more efficient, more effective, and create stronger and more sustainable outcomes? So we'll be discussing a little bit of that today, and I will share some tricks, some tools, and some resources along the way to help you think more strategically around leadership and what we consider institutional breakthrough. So with that, I think we have a poll that we will be leading. So before we kick it off, Jessica, do we want to do the poll, please? We want to ask people about their leadership. I don't know how these polls work. There we go. So do you fully understand what it means to be a leader? Just please answer the poll question. If you guys see the poll, if you guys can just make your way through the poll so that we can keep going. All right, with that, can we close the poll? So I think on the most part, interesting. So from those who voted, 32% said yes, 12% said no, and 58% said maybe, which is very exciting because we're going to ask you again later on. So a quick overview, we're going to go through effective diagnostics, problem understanding, testing assumptions, adaptive leadership, and different aspects of change management throughout this training. So it's a lot of high-level things. I hope you have a pen and paper and are excited to jump in with us. So why are we here? When we look at the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole, we have this amazingly ambitious agenda. We just entered into the decade of action. We have 10 years left to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals. But unfortunately, we have a $2.5 trillion annual deficit to achieve the SDGs. And that number was actually before COVID and before the pandemic that has set us further behind both on the climate agenda and the development agenda at large, where we're seeing that COVID has exacerbated inequalities. We are increasingly seeing poverty crippling communities that were already crippled by poverty and all of the outcomes of inequality and equity. Wars are surging, social unrest is surging around the world. And we truly believe that talent is distributed equally around the world, but opportunity is not. And unfortunately, when we talk about policy and development, we talk about it void of what we consider fluffy, soft skills like empathy and compassion and humanity, which we truly believe at the Humanity Lab Foundation is central to actually creating change in a meaningful way. Because as we'll unpack today through our training, a lot of the issues rather that we're not creating progress on are anchored in behavior change, anchored in the aspirations, thoughts, and perspectives of communities. And as we go into this, I ask you a simple question: is racism a thing or is it a mindset? Is homophobia a thing or is it a mindset? Is sexism a thing or is it a mindset? So a lot of these issues that are plaguing our societies and fueling inequality are anchored in the beliefs and values and aspirations that we have as individuals that collectively make up a society. So again, I ask, how can we make progress if we don't integrate human behavior into our change management? So with that, uncertainty is the key to creativity. And so if you leave here today with more questions, if you leave this workshop frustrated or asking yourself tons of questions, then I have succeeded. Because a huge first step to leadership is really being able to understand what's not working and why. So unlearning, really setting the expectations that unlearning is actually so important. So we're going to start by figuring out problem statements. So what is a problem statement? A problem statement fundamentally helps us understand two things. Number one is it helps us guide our mission and really understand how we're doing the work that we're going to do. And number two, which is oftentimes forgotten about, is it helps us communicate what we're doing to other people. And the good news is a problem statement is not a mission statement or a vision statement. It actually adapts and it evolves. So the more you learn, the more you gain expertise, the more you evolve your problem statement with time. Now, here is an example of a problem statement. So first, you have the current state. Where are we now? Then you have your future state. Where do we want to be? And the next example of this is where we are now is there's racism built into our society. Where we want to be is we want a society with systems and policies that are equal to everybody. And notice I don't say a system with no racism or a community with no racism, because that will continue to manifest in other ways. So systemic change is often about identifying a future state that is one that is adaptable. And I'll explain what I mean. So for a problem statement, fixing the problem has to do with understanding how do we get from our current state to our future state? What do we need to fix to get from here to here? And that gap is where we start to understand what do we have to do to move our society from this where we've identified we are today to where we need to go here. And that gap is leadership. Closing that gap, developing the tools, the knowledge, the conversations is where we need to start thinking about a reframe of leadership. Leadership is a process and not a solution. And the leadership capacity that you build is your capacity to bring societies, communities from where we are today to where we need to go. And I'll explain what this means in practice. So how do we even start to solve things? And again, I will be going fast through this because I have 1 hour, but I will invite you all to take a longer training if you're interested in it. We do have a 3-hour masterclass, so don't worry. We will support you through this process as much as possible. This is just more to whet your palate and to give you some big picture skills. So where do we go to start to solve things? So first, fundamentally, when you are in a hurry, slow down. Now, what do I mean by that? When you're in a hurry, oftentimes what we want to do is we want to get frantic and say, we have to solve things so urgently and so quickly. So we just start to throw solutions at problems without stopping and saying, whoa, what's happening? Without stopping and saying, whoa, what's happening? We are quick to assume we know what's happening. We are quick to push our own institutional agendas, our own biases, our own limited knowledge on deciding what is happening. Now, if you have the wrong problem framing in the beginning, are you going to solve the right problem? No, the answer is no. So when you're surrounded by chaos and uncertainty and deadlines, stop. An example I use for this to drive this point home is in an emergency room. When there is an accident and someone comes to an emergency room, the first thing that you do when someone enters an emergency room is, what is their blood type? What happened? How long have they been injured? Do they have allergies? Asking yourself questions. Then collectively, as a group, each entity leverages their expertise to then contribute to that diagnostic. If someone comes in with a failing heart, do you operate on their foot? No, you would likely kill them. So why do we approach problems like this when we approach big scale issues like food insecurity or gender inequality, right? The second of all is, which water do you swim in? Oftentimes we are so passionate about the issues that we care about that we take for granted that everyone understands them the same way. We don't question our assumptions. We have been born into communities where, I, for example, I come from a Muslim Arab background. I know racism because I've experienced it. Whereas when I project that onto someone else who may not have that same reference point, I am not stopping and asking myself, what's the water in which I swim? What's the water in which they swim? And I put an image of a fish here because fish don't wake up every morning and say, oh, I'm swimming today. And we likely don't wake up every morning and say, oh, I'm breathing air today. We just take for granted the things that are around us. And the familiar is filled with assumptions. And now, why is this important? So I'm going to ask you all to see, what is the problem? What do you see? So can you all see my video still? Yeah? Can you give me a little yes if you have? Perfect. Okay, so here's this piece of paper. So what do you see? And unfortunately, this isn't as interactive as I would like it to be. So you can write your comments in there. I can see them. So how would you guys describe what you see here? What is this thing that you see here? It's a blank page. Yeah. So it's a rectangular, plain, blank page. Perfect. Most people have the same reference points. You guys all know what a page is. Now, if I was to do this, it's the same blank page, right? So imagine we're all sitting around this blank page. How would you describe what you see here? You have to give a description of this to where someone can paint it or draw it. What is that? It looks like a bird, a crumpled paper, a swan. That's creative. Yeah, I see a whale. I can see a swan. Now, if Daniel says it looks like a swan, but if Rebecca Evans, who said it looks like a ball of paper, Jessica says it looks like a whale. So what if Daniel and Jessica, Daniel's never seen a whale and Jessica's never seen a swan. So instead of actually figuring out what this is together, Jessica's like, no, Daniel, this is a whale. And Daniel's like, no, Jessica, it's a swan, because they don't have the same reference point. Now, even if there was consensus around what this thing is, I'm looking at it from a whole nother perspective. That's what it looks like to me. And that does look like a fish. But if I do it like that, it looks like something else, and so on and so forth. And so what do you see is heavily influenced by your experience and knowledge, right? Perspectives. We all have perspectives that are based on our backgrounds, our experiences, our community, and our education. So when I come to a group and I say gender equality is this, and someone else has a different reference point, then so often we're not stopping. When you're in a hurry, what do? Slow down and question the water in which you swim, right? So we go into these events, we go into these meetings, we go into these debates and conversations on inequity around the SDGs, armed with our own perspectives. And oftentimes, a lot of these meetings turn contentious because we are constantly trying to encourage other people to see things the way we do, right? So that brings me to the question, if we do not see the same thing, are we solving the same thing? Right? So I think we have a poll question number 2. So Jessica, do you want to do the poll, please? Do you consider yourself a leader currently? I can't see how many people have voted. So do you consider yourself a leader? Go ahead and respond as quick as you can so we can dive right on in. Okay. So I think most people have responded. Okay, so I want to see the responses. How can I do so? Ta-da. Welcome to technology. Perfect. So 51% consider themselves a leader already, 14% say no, and 36% say maybe. I love the 36% because quite frankly, I think there's so much room to innovate in the space of leadership. So wonderful. That's really helpful to know. If we don't see things the same way, and this is going to be helpful as we continue to go to see where you guys are on these various issues. So if we don't see things the same way, are we solving the same thing? And I would say that ineffective diagnostics is one of the biggest pitfalls on leadership in creating meaningful impact, because we're constantly solving for what we assume to be the problem rather than what the actual problem is. Don't worry, we're going to unpack all of this stuff. So first and foremost, as a leader, your fundamental first step is getting unstuck. Getting unstuck means we have to unpack what we see to then understand what we do not see, right? The patterns and events which are observable are caused by systemic structures and models which are hidden. So if I look at this iceberg, if I was to treat the iceberg from the little tiny part that I can see, then what am I missing? I'm missing the massive bulk of the iceberg that holds it in place. Back to our lovely piece of crumpled up paper. If I am treating this paper through the vantage point of what I see, I am missing everything else. I am missing a fundamental understanding of what is actually going on. So diving below the surface is really important, and there are 4 fundamental steps to doing that. First, this is called the iceberg system and belief model. And this is a great tool to have in your little toolbox. So we're going to build your toolbox today. The first model, this iceberg model, helps you understand that the observable events, of what you can see, are oftentimes where most of us are stuck. That's where most of us solve problems. Now, underneath the events, under that water, are the patterns of behavior over time. So this is saying there may have been a racial event once, right? There may have been a hate crime once. There may have been, a misogynistic moment once, right? But that is not just a one-off thing. We can now see that this is actually systemic. It happens over time. That pattern is held in place because of a system that enables it. Now, the system could be legal systems, it could be social systems, it could be social norms, religious practices, education levels. Multiple things make up systems. Systems are what govern the society around us. Some of it we can see, some of it we cannot see. Some of it is rule-based, some of it is just assumed to be rule-based, like cultural norms, for example. Underneath those systems, which is the hardest part, are beliefs. So belief systems are what hold in place the entire iceberg model. So for example, if I believe that women have a certain role in society, then I will create, both directly and indirectly, systems that then create patterns that manifest into events. You see how this works? So you can work up and down the iceberg. You can understand events by diving in, understanding the water in which you swim, and diving and diagnosing what are the beliefs that are holding this in place. I mean, if you look at all of the SDGs, all of them are anchored in deeply rooted beliefs. Inequality is anchored in the belief of who deserves what. Our entire GDP systems are anchored in the belief that economic prosperity will dismantle inequality. Has human history proven that to be true? right? It comes down to beliefs. So here's what you can start to do. Here's a model, another tool in your toolkit to start understanding this. So what's happening now that you're trying to solve? Underneath it, you have to write, what are the patterns of behavior that you are not only have identified, but you're witnessing? Now, what are the systems that are keeping this in place? And what are the beliefs that are keeping that system in place? So you can start to map this out. These are all tools to help you to diagnose, right? Now, the first step to effective leadership is getting everyone to see the same thing, right? So I would ask you to ask yourself these 4 questions to start. Number 1, what is the problem as I or my organization see it? Now, why is it so important to say I or my organization? If I come to this assuming that everyone here has the same perspective, then I have failed as a leader, because I am now projecting my own assumptions, my own institutional mandate, my own agenda onto everybody else, right? So ask yourself, what is the problem that I see? Now, the second step is to say, well, do others see the problem the same way? Do people see it the same way? And that is where you start to understand other perspectives. And we're going to get into how to do this. This is just a framework. The third is, who is impacted by this problem? Who are the people that are literally living the consequences of failed policy? Who are the people who are benefiting? Who are the people who are not benefiting? And so on and so forth. Now, the fourth component is, does it impact everybody the same way? Again, some people are benefiting from broken systems. Some people are benefiting from racism and inequality and sexism. These are actual realities that we must start to confront and understand in a diagnostics process. So how do you get people to start seeing the same thing if you don't fully understand it? So understanding problems begins with fundamentally unpacking them, right? So there are 3 types of problems. They don't have complicated names. It's a type 1, a type 2, and a type 3 problem. Understanding problems will help you start to realize and learn what capacity you have to build to close that gap that I talked about in your problem statement. How do you get from your current state to your future state? Understanding what the nature of the problem is will help you understand what capacity do you build to be able to get the trust, credibility, and knowledge to close that gap, right? So there's 3 types of problems. Problem 1, super easy, type 1 problem. The problem is clear, the solution is clear, and we already have a person responsible for fixing it. And we're going to get into the difference between authority and leadership later, because people confuse them with each other quite a bit. So an authority is a person who has a role, who has been assigned a role, whether it's by society, they have a job, they have a paycheck, whatever it could be. It doesn't have to be formal. Authority figures are also tribe leaders, for example. Those are people who have an authority role. And so there is an expectation of them that they will solve X problem. Now, an example of a type 1 problem is a traffic light. If a traffic light goes down in your society, there's usually consensus that traffic lights are important because they help manage traffic, right? Not many people are going to say, no, traffic lights are horrendous, they're wrong, they're incorrect. There's usually fundamental consensus. Now, the solution is clear. If a traffic light is down, there's probably either an electrical issue, someone hit the wire. I mean, we don't have to innovate too much to find solutions. But the third and most fundamental part of this is that there's an authority figure, right, that's responsible for fixing it. So you're either your government, your county, the local electrician, there's someone whose job it is to fix it. So Giannis, who just posted it in the chat, Giannis is not sitting there saying, oh my goodness, let's bring together all the community leaders to figure out how to diagnose this problem or solve it. No, it's already easy. So it's a type 1 problem. The nature of the challenge is clear. We have the appropriate tools to address it, and somebody is responsible for fixing it. Type 1 problem, the easiest types of problems. Type 2 problem. The problem definition is clear. We know what the problem is. The solution definition, however, requires learning. Requires learning means we don't actually know what the adequate solution is. There are maybe multiple solutions, maybe we don't have consensus around the solutions, and so on and so forth. And so we say requires learning because a lot of leadership is around bringing people around your understanding and creating consensus, which requires learning, collective learning, right? And so who's responsible for that? An authority figure in a type 2 problem does not have the power to change it because they don't own the solution, nor has society given them the authority to solve on our behalf. An example of a type 2 problem is school lunches. There is a lot of consensus around the fact that children require food in order to have proper nutrition and for their brains to function and for them to be healthy students and be able to kind of learn and grow, right? So a type 2 problem is a problem where we have consensus on the problem. We all understand what the problem is, which is nutrition is critical for the development, fundamental development of the brain and outputs of a child. There's not really many people that will argue with that, and some might, but most won't. The challenge solution now is a little more confusing. Who's responsible for fixing this? Is it parents that need to teach their children or need to provide food? What if their parents are living in poverty? Should children simply not go to school? Is it the government's responsibility? Is it the private sector's responsibility? Is it the people who set the prices of food? Responsibility? There could be an array of stakeholders that need to be involved in that conversation. So that is a type 2 problem where the nature of the problem is clear, food insecurity impacting children. But the solution, however, we don't have a consensus and we don't know who's responsible because not one person is responsible for solving this problem. Now, type 3 problem gets even more confusing, right? We don't even agree what the problem is. We don't know what a solution is because we can't agree on the problem, and who the heck is responsible for fixing it? So an example of a type 3 problem is gun violence. We see this debate not only in the United States, but all over the world. What is the problem? Are problems the guns? Well, people will tell you, well, it's not guns that are problems because guns don't kill people, people kill people. And then other people will say, well, it's not people, it's video games that are influencing our youth, or it's broken families, or it's television shows that are sensationalizing violence. And what is the problem? Is it guns? Is it people? Is it mental health? Is it lack of parenting? Is it crumbling social systems? What is the problem? And so if you cannot identify what the problem is, then how can I jump to a solution where now we are seeing in real time people say things like, well, we should create legislation for gun control. Well, someone else will say, well, no, we should do mental health checks. Well, who's to say you can intervene into my privacy? And then people are like, no. Well, we should just arm all children with guns. We should arm teachers. We should this and that and the other. Well, we don't agree what the fundamental problem is. So how are we going to agree on a solution? And who's responsible? In a type 2 and a type 3 problem, even if someone has the role, for example, the president of a nation, they do not have the power to actually solve the problem. Again, the difference between authority and leadership. We're going to get into that in just a moment. So a type 1 problem is called a technical problem. I like to imagine this as someone who has tools. So if you can fix it with tools, it's likely a technical problem, right? It's something that is clear. We already have a solution in mind and we already know who is responsible. So think about like literally hammering something. A type 2 and a type 3 problem, on the other hand, are a little more complex. They are called adaptive problems. Now, in adaptive problems, the gap in learning between where we are today and where we need to go requires knowledge, consensus, unlearning, challenging biases, challenging assumptions, digging into the bottom of the iceberg, right? Not easy. So oftentimes the massive failure in framing is that we treat way too many adaptive issues as technical issues. We want to throw quick fix solutions on really challenging social issues because we simply don't have an ecosystem that allows us to collectively diagnose and solve big scale issues in a sustainable way. And oftentimes, I hate to say it because I'm sure most of you represent fantastic organizations, but so many organizations are so fixated on their institutional mandates and appeasing to their donors or being able to show success metrics or being able to make whoever, communities proud of their work. That's what they're focused on versus collective solution-based thinking, which is a whole nother skill set. And I would venture to say that we have a catastrophe of lack of leadership in the world because we do have a lot of authority that are pushing specific agendas, but we don't have collective societal leadership. The adaptive problems are challenging. Adaptive problems are challenging because we have to acknowledge that the community doesn't have the skills or knowledge required to address a problem. It doesn't mean that we're incompetent or we don't have enough education. It is more so saying that we don't have an ecosystem or an environment to bring together the right stakeholders, the right knowledge, the right experience, and the right passion to actually address these issues. And with an adaptive problem, there's no quick fix. There's no quick fix. It requires us unearthing deeply troubling and challenging social norms, societal norms, challenging systems and infrastructures, I mean, including the UN system that was built 75 years ago on colonial legacies and post-World War II, right? With the time the United Nations was established, there were only 50 nation states in the world. We are living in a world today where we have over 200 nation states, and the system and the basic fundamental structure of the UN has hardly changed when you look at the UN Security Council and all of that. So fundamentally, we need to change systems, which requires time. And more importantly, no one is to blame in an adaptive problem. Blame traps don't work. Blaming and finger pointing, saying it's a government's responsibility. Nope, it's multilateralism that's failing. Nope, it's donors. Nope. Well, guess what? Every stakeholder has a role to play in unpacking and solving adaptive problems. So adaptive problems requires transforming these beliefs so they're at the bottom of the pyramid. So how do we get down there? How do you encourage not only you to get down there, but how do you pull other people down there? You know, how does Jessica or Raul, for example, convince people to dig and dive into the depth of the unknown, where I cannot tell you that if you do one, it will lead to two result, where so many people look for leaders to solve things. Leadership is often about not solving things. It's creating an ecosystem to enable the right conversations, which is why I want to reframe what it means to be a leader, right? So authority means you have a title and a role, and people look to you to solve things. Example, the traffic light. In a leader type position, you don't have to have a role to lead. You can actually earn informal authority. Leadership is about influencing outcomes. It is not about driving a solution. Let me restate that. Leadership is about influencing outcomes. It's about bringing people and closing that gap. It's not about saying the answer is blank, which is oftentimes what we look to for leadership. So authority versus leadership. In adaptive problems, to reiterate that authority does not work. Not only does it not work, but oftentimes people lack trust, right? We don't trust authority. We feel let down by authority. So just because you have a role does not mean that you have the power to influence an outcome. And even if you have authority and you have trust and you have influence, when I went through your type 2 and type 3 problem, it does not mean that you can solve it alone. To the contrary, if you fully believe you can, you are likely lacking in your leadership skills, because problem solving in an adaptive problem shifts to stakeholders. Your role as a leader is to spark and ignite. It is not to solve on behalf of. And this is where a lot of development institutions and organizations fail, because they come to solutions, they come to communities with solutions. It doesn't really look at localizing outcomes and really understanding the perspectives of local community members. So leadership is a role, right? Sorry, leadership is not a role, apologies. It's a process. It's a process of influencing an outcome. I like to think about leadership also as kind of like you having a match, right? So you find sticks, you find, for example, fuel, and you find paper. Your job as a leader is not to create a fire. It is to light that spark of that match that then brings together the pieces that create the fire. You do not create the fire. You do not have the power to create a fire. So a lot of leadership is about understanding your role in facilitating and not feeling attached to a specific outcome, because the fire will take shape based on the different pieces that are there. They're not yours to control. They're not yours to own. So how do you start to understand a system enough to influence it? First and fundamentally, test your assumptions. Again, when you go in and you say, this is a swan, or this is a whale, as Daniel and I believe Jessica were saying earlier. What is actually happening? So there's two types of relationships. There's one which is called a causational relationship, and then there's a correlational relationship. This is another tool for your toolbox. So a causational relationship is when you say this happened because this happened, right? The occurrence of one thing created directly an outcome. Because this, then this. I'll give you an example on the next slide. A correlational relationship is saying that this can happen and this can happen, but it's not because of each other. There might be a third factor. And it's really important to understand if it's causation and correlation, because so many times we say there is gender inequity because there's lack of access to education. And we create a program that does that without stopping and testing assumptions to say, if we create more education programs, are we solving gender inequity? Maybe the issue is a whole nother problem, but we're so fixated on projecting our own assumptions of what the problem is that we don't actually understand relationships and cause and effect, right? Just because you build schools, there's a lot of argument about this now with soft skills and do kids even need education? Do they need more technical skills? You have so many graduates of universities, majority of which are unemployed, and so on and so on and so on. So testing our assumptions collectively as society is how we start to dismantle systems that don't work. Understanding what's happening, an example, causational relationship, because this, then that. So because it's hot, right? Heat goes up, summertime is here, more people buy ice cream. There's a direct correlation between heat and summer and consumption of ice cream and or other ice-based products. More companies are selling them. There's ice cream trucks. It's like cultural and so on and so forth. Now, correlational relationship says, because this, then this is happening, but they're not connected to each other. Sorry, because this is happening and this is happening, they're not connected to each other. An example of which, using the same analogy from above, in the summertime, ice cream sales increase and house break-ins increase. Now, do house break-ins increase because robbers are walking around eating ice cream? No. House break-ins increase because more people are traveling in the summer, more people leave their doors and windows open in the summer, more people are not home in the summer, right? So there are two things that are happening in parallel because of a third variable. So if I was to diagnose, and look at this as my problem statement, if I was to come in here and say, well, we need to stop the sales of ice cream because more home robberies are happening, would I be solving the right problem? Nope. That's a prime example of the incorrect cause-effect relationship. So a great way to do that is to start testing assumptions. This is another tool for your toolbox. 5 whys. Ask yourself why 5 times when you think you have a statement, a problem statement. It causes you to interrogate, to really unpack and to really understand what it is that you're saying and how you think about it. Right? It helps you also get to a root cause of a problem rather than focusing on solving symptoms. So the 5 reasons to use the 5 whys, number 1 is it helps you really get underneath. So if I want to say house break-ins are happening because more ice cream sales are happening, well, why? Why will help you start to really push past and understand root causes. Now, when you do that, you move away from quick fix solutions to actually unpacking complexity, right? The second is it allows you to move towards evidence-based analysis. So many times we create programs because we believe that they are critical rather than stopping and actually addressing what's actually happening. And I know that there are a lot of challenges with also metrics around behavior change, which is something that we're really invested into at the Humanity Lab, because so many times behavioral change cannot be pinpointed to one specific moment. But what the 5 whys allows us to do is to start unpacking and developing analysis to help us understand different levels of change as they happen. The third is it allows you to eliminate systemic issues. So in some cases, you have one broken part of the system that keeps recreating itself. And so with the 5 whys and with proper diagnostics, you can then isolate the systemic issue and move it to the side and actually solve the adaptive problem. Because in some problems, there are adaptive and technical problems that are intertwined. So you can solve parts of it, deal with them, and then you can actually figure out what the adaptive problem is at large. The 4th reason is it allows you to create an environment that welcomes change. So many times we as leaders get so fixated feeling like we have to own success of an outcome. In adaptive problems, you cannot do that. Fundamentally, that's against the entire premise of an adaptive problem. We have to start pushing collective action and collective responsibility. And so you create an environment that starts to welcome change and embraces incremental progress. Again, you solve small parts of it that leads to bigger systemic change, but we cannot solve everything or nothing. So asking yourself five whys will allow you to start getting into symptoms and symptoms and symptoms, and it's another tool for effective diagnostics. Example being, there's a puddle of water on the floor. Now, if I just go and wipe that puddle every single day in my office, and what am I doing? I'm treating it as a technical problem. But if I'm not stopping and saying, why is that happening? Then I will never actually start to understand more specifically what's fundamentally creating this problem that is manifesting as the event. What's that bottom of that iceberg? And so this is just an example. Well, whoa, the overhead pipe is leaking. Well, why is that happening? Well, there's too much water pressure on the pipe. Well, why is that happening? There's a faulty control valve. Well, why is that happening? Because it hasn't been tested. Why is that happening? Because it's not on the maintenance schedule. Now, if I was solving down here, I would have to now involve building maintenance, finance, facilities management, a whole bunch of other people to say, why has this thing not been happening? I wouldn't even be able to diagnose this level without involving people in this diagnostics process, right? So the point is, if I was to solve here and just go wipe the puddle every single day, am I actually solving the problem? No, I'm solving a symptom of a problem that's going to continue to recreate itself over and over and over. And unfortunately, this is where we are on most of the SDGs today. So what does adaptive leadership look like? Adaptive leadership is our capacity to navigate the uncertainty. To reiterate, it is not a role, it's an activity, and you can lead with or without authority. So it's really trying to understand. Leadership is the capacity to navigate change. There is no right solution. That's the fundamental first thing to get off your head as a leader. There is no right solution, because leadership is your ability to mobilize others to collectively create an outcome. You don't own it. And that is not only relieving, but it is also inspiring, because you can create systemic change because parts of society will transform themselves, right? You don't own the process. You do not own the process. Leadership is catalytical because no one owns a problem or a solution. So remember earlier when I told you guys adaptive leadership, you can't pinpoint blame, right? You can't point fingers. If no one owns the problem, then how are we going to blame each other for it? And realizing that it's about creating collective responsibility. So adaptive leadership in practice has three fundamental building blocks. Number one is that you bring people around the same problem. You get organizations and people and institutions to change their way of thinking, to acknowledge not only their role in the problem, but also in the solution, right? So it's not about everybody saying this is your responsibility, but it's every one of us saying, what is my role and what is my responsibility? The second is it challenges perceptions. It challenges organizations to let go of what they've been doing for years, to say, how can we create a place that welcomes failure, that welcomes collective growth, that welcomes letting go of everything I hold to be true? Again, remember two things. What's the water in which you swim? And when you're in a hurry, slow down. Challenging perspectives will now enable you to start thinking about the right conversations with the right people. And the third is it will help you understand the capacity that has to be built. What is the capacity that has to be built, and how do we build it to bridge that gap? So here's another tool for your toolbox. Stop and ask yourself, what's spinning? When a hurricane or tornado is approaching your community, you have to understand what's going on before you get on TV or radio and say, everyone evacuate, because what happens if you do that? You create chaos. Stop, and understanding the mess is stopping and saying, okay, what speed is this thing going? What direction is this thing going? Who's spinning? What's happening? Where did it come from? How did it get here? Where is it going? Questions. So many times we are told that leadership is about walking into a room and having answers. I will challenge us moving forward to think about leadership being about going into a room and asking awesome questions. It's about getting people to give you insights, give you access into their worlds, to invite you to dive with them and hand in hand with them into the darkness, right? That's about that. You cannot answer those questions without fundamentally having curiosity, genuine, authentic curiosity, right? So understanding the mess. Now, how do you do that? Another tool for our toolbox. This is a stakeholder mapping. So we have to start understanding our stakeholders. Who are they? Who are the people who have an influence in this, good or bad, right? Who are the people who have a different definition of the problem and why? But the last two I love the most. Who are the missing voices? And why are they not there? And what are the unknowns? What are the things that we simply do not know and why? So how do you even figure out who your stakeholders are? We create a table. I love actually bringing this to life with a dining room table, a cafeteria table, it could be whatever, a picnic table, whatever you and your family sit around, or you and your friends, who's at your table? Giving personas to stakeholders is really helpful. So many times we walk in with assumptions about our stakeholders. Governments are blank. The UN is blank, right? I used to work for the Secretariat at the UN, and so many times the work that I was doing was explaining to people how the UN was a secretariat of member states and how the different agencies work. There is no such thing as the UN is blank. We need to also understand what are the systems that are outraging us and we're outraged by. Unpack them, unpack them, unpack them. Because the step to working towards solving adaptive problems is understanding the mess, right? So who's at your table? Personify them. Here's an example. Let me put my type 2 problem in the center here. Ensuring children in school are not hungry. Remember, that was our type 2 problem from earlier. So who are the people who have an influence in this conversation, who have a vested interest in its outcome, who are impacted by this problem, right? So you have parents, you have students, you have teachers. What about the hungry student themselves? What about the private sector, which is missing from here? What about the food industry, which is missing from here? And so on, and so on, and so on. And each of these stakeholders has a different problem. Fundamentally, they uniquely define the problem differently. Let's go back to our example. The student's problem is, I'm trying to focus. I can't focus because Bobby is constantly disrupting my class. As much as that student cares that Bobby is hungry, Bobby also is disrupting the class. And as such, that student cannot progress. And they're worried about getting good grades and getting into college. The teacher's perspective is she gets or he gets evaluated on the outcome of their class. So if they have hungry students in their class, as much as they care more about not being fired because the other students' parents are going to be complaining. A local government, as much as I care about what's happening in your school district, re-election is coming up. And my constituents that pay for my campaign care more about the potholes in the streets than they do about hungry students, right? People have competing problem statements. And what drives them are values, perspectives, losses, gains, worries, hopes, risks, and trade-offs. We have to understand what it is that people come with into our conversations, into our collective problem solving, right? What is the baggage that every single person brings into this room, right? I've talked about the local government official. If they're worried about re-election, guess what? I don't care how much they care about what's happening in your school district, their entire career is at stake and they have a family and they cannot afford to lose their job. Social services, NGOs are worried about losing their, for example, income and so on and so forth. So really understanding the values and the perspectives of each stakeholder will allow you to start to bring them to life. Who do they represent? Because behind every single stakeholder are layers that are unseen. Loyalties, belief systems, aspirations, identities, institutions, affiliations. If I am a representative of my government and I show up at your conversation, am I more loyal to you or to my boss, who's not in the room, but that voice is in my head driving the outcome of my conversation with you, right? We don't know all of these things until we ask, because all of the layers are unseen. So many times we walk in and we make the oil and gas industry the boogie monster to climate change, right? So look at the climate conversation where we don't really bring stakeholders around the table, because now we have really separated and divided communities that are hurling blame and responsibility at each other. Are we making progress on climate change? Are we making progress on gender equality? No, because those who don't believe in what we believe are getting further and further and further pushed into the darkness. Look at white supremacy in the United States. Look at hate crimes around the world. These things are happening. They're just being pushed into the darkness. Are we solving them? No, we're not. And then tables behind tables. Your stakeholders are here, but behind them, they have their own tables that they're loyal to and accountable to. And then behind that, there's layers and layers and layers of belief systems, of cultural norms. Look at peace and reconciliation projects where you can bring youth to a table, but the legacy of intergenerational trauma is what informs the conversations of today, despite the fact that a lot of these young people have never lived through the trauma themselves. We have to unpack these things, right? And so how does knowing who's at your table help you? It helps you fundamentally on 4 levels. Number 1, it helps you figure out how to engage people, how to communicate with them. How do you empathize with people that you vehemently disagree with? And how do you bring them into your vision for change? Right? So adaptive problems require you to bring stakeholders together and make it work, right? And that fundamentally is a core part of what your job is as an adaptive leader. You have to make everybody a winner. And that doesn't mean appeasing to people or, letting go of your values or foregoing your morals. To the contrary, it means developing the fortitude and the grit and the resilience to understand that you are simply a convener. Your job is to figure out how do you empathize with the different parts of the puzzle that own a part of the solution. You are a catalyst, right? And it's hard. And we dive into this in some of our other leadership trainings with how do you survive change? And when we say survive, in some communities, it is a life or death situation to be too much of an advocate. And in some situations, you get silenced if you say the wrong thing at the wrong time. So a lot of leadership is about understanding how and when to leverage your influence. In some places, you can actually leverage third-party influence. So maybe I'm not the right voice for this. Maybe then I find an ally who is, right? So there's a lot of training and tools that we can build on this. This is just the fundamental base block. So leadership, a new definition of leadership, which I love, is the process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. Has anything I've gone over so far told you that your role as a leader is to have the best solution? If that's your takeaway, then I failed. But I hope your takeaway is actually understanding that leadership is about catalyzing, facilitating, and the word I love, nurturing the leadership of others, because that's the only way we're going to solve problems. So leadership is not about having answers, not at all. It's about how do you bring people around the same problem and recognize what needs to be done? How do you help yourself and others see the difference between what's technical versus what's adaptive? How do you encourage people to let go of their assumptions and bring them around the same problem? How do you understand what capacity and knowledge and skills need to be built in order to bridge your gap of your current state to your future state, which requires transforming deeply held beliefs? And in societies, people don't believe change is possible because we've been jaded and let down, right? So how do you build the trust to take others below the water into the complexity, right? Into the unknown. How do you do that? So first and foremost, ask yourself, not only who is at my table, but where am I at my own table? How do I connect with everybody else? What are their interests? What are their needs? What are their loyalties? What are their aspirations? And how do they relate to my needs and loyalties and aspirations? So put your problem at the center and start to diagnose the next steps. And I realize I'm dwindling on time, And so I don't have time for Q&A, but feel free to connect with us later, and Jess can drop our email in the chat box. But how do you manage all the competing thoughts and desires and visions and agendas and fears? Because there's a lot of it, right? We're so used to the way we do things. Change fundamentally is uncomfortable. So one of the core principles, another tool for your toolbox, is how do you pace the work? How do you pace it? How do you make and hold the space to experiment, to allow for collective failure? It takes time, patience, empathy for yourself and others, understanding, and really uniquely getting to the heart of how do you with time change. And I use the picture of the massive freight ship. How many of you have looked into the distance and seen a ship and it's moving so slowly, right? And then you look away and then you look back 10 minutes later and the ship is gone, right? So change is incremental. And a big part of leadership is about allowing people to be okay with pacing work, no quick fix solutions. We always vote for leaders that tell us we're going to transform systems overnight. I will abolish this thing overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. Leadership is about holding back and about building trust to change over time, right? So developing the emotional intelligence, we have another tool here, which is called getting on the balcony, right? So stop, step back, get on the balcony, look at things from a vantage point that you're not in the middle of, right? So many times we're triggered because we're so emotional and we have all these agendas, and it's very, very, very triggering to a lot of people. So withdraw yourself from the situation. Allows you to remove judgment and stop projecting outcomes. And that is so important, because so many times if you don't have the emotional intelligence, you will not survive the process of adaptive leadership, because you have to be able to hold the perspectives of those that you may not agree with. You have to be able to hold space for failure. You have to be able to hold space to be told that you don't know how to lead and you're failing at leading, and all the various things that we like to project onto people in authority positions, right? And so getting on the balcony will allow you to stop when someone is hurling these insults at you, to say, whoa, hold on, this is not about me. I'm not the problem here. They're being triggered because I'm challenging their institutional legacy, or I'm challenging their beliefs and their norms, right? So it's very, very important to start to unpack this. Now, we do that by creating what we call a holding environment, a container. And this is the last tool that I will give you. A holding environment is like a pressure cooker, right? A pressure cooker is where you put everything in the pot and it boils with steam. So think about a pressure cooker. If it gets too hot with a pressure cooker, what happens? It explodes. If it doesn't get hot enough, what happens? You're not going to have soup. So your job as a leader, earlier I made you a fire starter, now you're going to be a chef. Think about all of your stakeholders that are around your table and personify them as vegetables. Again, super simple trick. I use it all the time. Does a potato and a tomato cook at the same speed and temperature? No. What happens if you do? The tomato will squish while the potato is not even cooked, right? So your job as a leader is to figure out, okay, well, I'm going to deal with my tomato separately at this speed and this temperature. I'm going to deal with my carrot at this speed and this temperature. I'm going to maybe saute my broccoli outside and then introduce it into the soup, right? You have to understand how to work with your stakeholders, in order to make the soup work. Not all stakeholders are the same. Some will be resistant to change. Some will be really excited. How do you pace it to where you bring together the ingredients, you manage to cook this beautiful broth, and the outcome is a collective win-win, because everyone's happy and everyone thrives and everyone is part of the soup in the way that makes sense to them. So it's about nurturing dialogue and conversation and managing expectations. And real change cannot happen in a silo or without other stakeholders. And I will leave you with this, and then we have one final poll question as we close out. But by embracing complexity, and only by embracing complexity, can we simplify. So many times we're told from the beginning, simplify things for me, simplify things. What I will encourage you to do, and this is part of the human-centered design process, is to bust open things, make them complex, make them confusing, ask why, and through that, then you can start to wind things down, and simplify them and deal with them in different buckets, in different perspectives. But by approaching it very limited from the beginning, you're completely missing the ecosystem approach, and you're missing the opportunity to create sustainable systemic change. And with that, I thank you so much for joining us. I'm at my time. We have one final poll question, which is, do you feel like this masterclass gave you the tools and understanding to be a better leader? And as I mentioned, this is the very short version of a much longer masterclass that we have. So I encourage you, I know Jessica posted it in the chat box, but we invite you all to join us. Finding Humanity, or sorry, the humanitylab.education is the longer masterclass, and I'm happy to send out tools and resources to all of you, because our goal fundamentally at the end of the day is to ensure that all people who are interested in helping solve and create solutions around the SDGs are equipped with the right tools, resources, and community to do so. You have so much power to create change, and it's the only thing that's going to make the Sustainable Development Goals achievable. Thank you. Thanks for all the comments too. And for everyone who's still listening, I mean, you guys can find us on social media. I'm pretty easy to find also, and Jessica, and we're happy to stay in touch with you all.